It's Rough Stone trolling again. I hope you all are doing okay. If you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. Please share this video or any of my other videos with people that you care about. That would mean a lot to me, and we can help grow this community together. Today I want to talk about Alex O'Connor's latest thoughts on free will. A lot of people have done other videos. I think they're fantastic. Free will is one of those topics that it's just inexhaustible. There's so many angles that you can take to tackle the issue of free will. And I wanted to do that today, is kind of just sort of unpack what Alex is saying a little bit. This isn't exactly a direct response to him because he, to be honest, he doesn't say that much, but he kind of just like touches on a few ideas that I think are sort of underdeveloped, that I think are actually really worthwhile. So to kind of give an overview of Alex O'Connor's thoughts, he was at some English university, and he was kind of just like, going through or going over a bunch of topics. And one of the things that he says that I found really interesting, is he said, yeah, a tree probably doesn't have free will because the type of being or the tree, the kind of a thing that it is, sort of doesn't lend itself to having free will. I'm like, yeah, that sounds exactly right. And then he doesn't move on past that, right? That's like, oh, okay. I'm like, oh, there's a lot here. I'm bummed he didn't explore that further. Um, and then he says, yeah, and then as far as free will goes, um, you know, um, there it seems he says, there seems to be different motivations, and they're sort of like at play, and you don't have free will because whatever your will was, your motivation was, it sort of like won in competition among, or it won a competition between all these other motivations, and it excuse me, and the motivation that finally won determined your behavior, so therefore you don't have free will. And then he says, and then he goes on further to say, yeah, well, and then Schopenhauer says that you can't even choose your will. You can will, but you can't choose your will, so you're most certainly not in control. And that's interesting. Um, Again, this is all within a span of 5 minutes. He doesn't really unpack it very much. That comment, along with his comment about the tree, is extremely interesting. I'm really bummed he didn't go into it. And then lastly, he says, yeah, plus there's this sort of like determinism versus indeterminism debate where if things are determined, then you can't have free will because your actions have been determined. And if the world or the universe is indeterminate, then you can't have free will either because the antecedents are not in any way related to the consequence. And so there's no control either because it doesn't follow from X that Y is the case. And so there's no relationship between X and Y, so there's no free will. And I actually agree wholeheartedly with that final point. The first 2 points are good. So yeah, so there's no relationship between the antecedents and the consequence, so you don't have free will. Um, Now I'm a psychology major, right? I just graduated in psychology and I did a minor in philosophy. And so I think there are really cool philosophical questions and discussions latent within all the comments that Alex has made. And I think psychology can actually like speak to a lot of these things. So first, um, what I'm gonna have to do to kind of unpack this is I'm gonna have to kind of give a brief history of a few a few thinkers, right? Kind of like early modernist thinkers, and then it's some postmodern thinkers, okay? And I think this will sort of like speak to what Alex is trying to get at, or not get at, but these are sort of like avenues that he could explore further, or that other people can explore further, and I want to explore them today. um, so in early modern thought, right, Descartes is kind of like the big figure. Descartes is famous for his famous phrase, "Cogito ergo sum." I think, therefore I am, and that statement proposes dualism. Right, dualism is this idea that you have sort of like the physical world, and then you have like maybe like a supernatural world, and there's this dichotomy between the body and the soul. And so Descartes, his position is something like, yeah, I'm an embodied being. I have a body, and my body's influenced, and it's stimulated and it responds to things. But ultimately, I have a soul that's like the true self, the true I, and it's the thing that's willing, things about. I want to do X, Y, and Z, so I'm going to do them. And I will those things, but my body is the thing doing those things. Or, my body's the thing doing them, but I will them to happen. Thank you so much, sir. Appreciate it. And so, yeah, so that's a, very popular idea. Descartes, is extremely influential. And he also, not only does he set that up, this dualism, but it sets up another dichotomy. It sets up a dichotomy between the subjective and the objective. And what he does is he invents Cartesian graphing, right? So you can take an x-axis and a y-axis, and you can plot some points and represent space on a graph. And you add more, you add a third axis, and you can now represent three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional image. And what that does, and his other philosophical thoughts, kind of what they sort of propose is that there's an objective way of looking at things where you're sort of like detached from the phenomenon and you're sort of outside of it and you're observing it from a detached point of view. And we typically refer to that as like something that's objective. So when you plot something mathematically, um, you're sort of doing that in an objective fashion. Now, Nietzsche comes along in the 19th century and he starts to challenge modernist ideas. And he outright rejects Descartes. And he says, "Yeah, dualism, no way, it's out. It leads to nihilism because we can't access the supernatural world, and therefore it's meaningless. And it also makes us discount the world as as it's instantiated to us now." And so he says there's a nihilism in dualism. So he also rejects the idea of an egoic Cartesian self. So he says, yeah, Descartes, his I think therefore I am, he presupposes that there's an I in the first place, and there's no evidence for that, so I'm rejecting it. So that's really real harsh critique. But Nietzsche is such a nuanced thinker that he starts to challenge all sorts of positions that are pretty popular in his day, right? He goes after Kant, um, he goes after science. He challenges the idea of causality. And so Nietzsche is really just kind of like flipping things over, and he's kind of like he's a really rebellious spirit, let's say. And he's also very interested in the development of psychology. For him, psychology is sort of like the philosophy of the future, and he says all major issues are going to be psychological issues. Um, Even so much so that he goes on to say that psychology is the queen of the sciences. So in 1900, Nietzsche dies, and in that same year, Freud appears on the scene and he publishes his interpretation of dreams. And in that book is where he introduces to the world his theory of psychoanalysis. Now, Freud, honestly, Freud he's a titan. He's a genius. He's a neurologist or a neuro surgeon. I can't remember which one, but he's into neurology, right? And he says, yeah, there's these patients that have these symptoms that do not have neurological causes. We don't know why they're expressing themselves, why they're manifesting themselves. And so he comes up with this theory of psychoanalysis in order to treat people with these psychosomatic symptoms, and it actually works. And so that's a huge breakthrough, right? Because there's no medical model that can account for these symptoms, let alone alleviate the symptoms. And Freud comes up with a theory to sort of like explain where they come from and then alleviate them. So it's a big deal. Psychoanalysis is a big deal. Anyway, so Freud, he does this, and he's also very worried that psychology is not going to be taken seriously as a science. In the wake of Nietzsche and his critique, people are abandoning religion. Atheism is very popular in Germany, and everyone is relying heavily on science and empiricism to advance medicine and advance different fields. So Freud feels the pressure of uh, making psychology scientifically legitimate, and he does so by taking up modernist assumptions, and more specifically, he takes positions that were very common amongst the logical positivists. Logical positivism is a particular brand of philosophy. They were very interested in science. They were very empirically based, and they would even go so far as to say something like, we sort of reject knowledge that is sort of like analytical and relies on logic to prove that certain things are the case. But if you can't observe them and if you can't see them or measure them, then you're really kind of just saying nonsense, because there's not a thing to refer to when you're talking about them. So what the heck are you talking about if you haven't been able to empirically observe them? Um, and so Freud is sort of like on that train, and he it's kind of a conundrum, because on the one hand, Freud is sort of positing this unconscious, right? There's a psyche out there that's not conscious, so you can't see it, you don't have access to it. Um, and then he also posits like a tripartite model of the mind, where the mind is divided into three parts, and they all have kind of different desires and different motivations and things like that. But as a neurologist, he can't point to the brain and say, okay, there's the brain structure that corresponds to the id and the ego and the superego. So Freud is, again, like I said, he's worried that his theory is not going to be taken seriously, but he's optimistic that science will one day catch up to psychoanalysis, and we'll be able to observe and measure all the things he's talking about, right? The unconscious, the three parts of the psyche. He's confident that that will one day be observed. Okay. Now Freud becomes hugely popular, right? Up through the 60s. He's deeply influential, especially in Europe, not so much in the United States, but all the serious thought is happening in Europe anyway. So what happens next is Heidegger appears on the scene in the 30s, and he is interested in what it means to be a human being, right? He's interested in human ontology. And so he writes a book called Being in Time. It's an incredible book. You really have to wrestle with it, because it's written in a fashion that intentionally tries to break the way that you typically think about things. So it's a hard read, but he's worried about what it means to be human. He's trying to investigate, what's the fundamental existential aspects of human being, right? And so that's kind of what he's concerned about. And he too starts to criticize Descartes. He says, yeah, Descartes, we have never, ever, ever in the history of mankind have ever observed anything from an objective or detached point of view. It's just never happened. So I don't know how you can talk about that. And he starts to criticize as well the dichotomy between objective and subjective. He says that's a false dichotomy, because we've never seen anything in an objective manner. So he starts to challenge that. And then what he does, much later, he starts to criticize Freud, and he says, okay, Freud made a serious error in his theory, because according to Freud, your behavior is determined by the interplay between the three parts of the psyche. The three parts of the psyche have different motivations, different desires, and you experience emotion. And those things are in conflict and they're in play, and whichever motivation sort of wins determines your behavior. That's very much what Alex O'Connor is saying in his video, right? You don't have free will, because different motivations are in competition, and the one that wins determines your behavior. Therefore, you did not determine your behavior. Therefore, there's no free will. Now, Heidegger says, okay, there's a problem with this, because Freud believes, because of his logical positivism, that motivation, desire, emotion, desire, and motivation are things like physical things, like atoms and molecules that bump into each other, and there's a chain of causation and of causal force. He says, but your emotion and motivation and desire, they're not like that at all. And not only that, you can't even measure them. And so according to Freud's logical positivism, it's hard to even make a case that they're real because you can't measure them. And so, and if they can't be measured, then certainly they don't have causal force. And so that whole argument about competing motivation is a non-starter, right? They're competing motivations. They're not like billiard balls that are bumping into one another. They don't have causal force, and you can't measure them, so you can't infer that they caused any kind of behavior. And so instead, Heidegger proposes this whole other system. You're gonna have to go read Being in Time to kind of get to the bottom of it. But I will say that Heidegger relies on phenomenology and on logic and philosophy to sort of make his case. So that addresses the competing motivations argument. And in the free will, at least in this video, the free will discussion kind of, the way that Alex sort of sets it up, he says, well, you know, we can presume free will, but because of the competing motivation argument, that negates free will. We've just negated that argument, so free will is back on the table. But let's assume again, that for the sake of argument, that free will does not exist, right? And the postmodernists in particular have a certain model for human beings that this model is a model that describes human behavior in society in light of there being no free will, right? So specifically, I'm talking about Foucault. Foucault takes up Nietzsche's project, and he starts to conduct investigations, specific public institutions, using what's called like a genealogical method. It's a method that Nietzsche develops. And a big part of this method is what Nietzsche calls the will to power, right? So in Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals, he sort of like describes a history of morality where different groups are in conflict, and each group is driven by a will to power, and each group's expression of the will to power plays out, and that gives rise to our modern day conceptions of morality. It's a brilliant book, by the way. You should definitely read it. Of all the books Nietzsche wrote, that one is the one you should read. I think it's the most accessible one too. Foucault takes the same idea and he applies it to things like mental health clinics. He applies it to prisons, and he also applies it to sexuality. And it's very interesting reading. It's very cynical reading, but what Foucault sort of proposes, he says, okay, he rejects as well that humans have free will. He even rejects that they have a soul. Again, in direct opposition to Descartes and even people like Plato and Socrates. Foucault says instead you have sort of like, you have this will to power, and this will to power sort of like unfolds in discourse. And so he will say will to power is discursive. So people are talking, they have ideas, they're talking towards one another, and they're sort of like expressing will to power, and the conversation that's going on a societal level is sort of like shifting things and changing how society organizes itself. And he says anywhere that there's knowledge, that there's power, and any type of discourse that's interested in expanding knowledge is really also expanding power. So there's this sort of like this power knowledge, will to power, that's driving human discourse, and that's giving rise to all the public institutions, all the popular opinions we hold today. Now, the problem with Foucault's and the whole postmodern project is that no one, including Nietzsche, nobody defines what will to power is. They don't give an ontology for what will to power it is. They don't explain what kind of a thing will to power is. And different philosophers and psychologists who adopt will to power, they each have their own take on what it is, but there's no consensus about what will to power is. So what that means is that the model for humanity that lacks free will has a huge gap in it. It's underdeveloped. And so again, that's sort of just like a non-starter. And we can reject the postmodern model of the postmodern model of humanity that has no free will. We can reject it on the grounds that it's not it's underdeveloped, and so therefore it's unsound. So now we can reject modernist, which is like Freud. We can reject modernist models of a type of humanity that lacks free will, and we can reject postmodern models of humanity that also lack free will. So where does that leave us, right? What comes next? Well, this is where Alex O'Connor, again, it's underdeveloped. He says, well, a tree can't have free will because of the kind of being that it is. Gantt and Williams at BYU, they wrote this fantastic paper for Frontiers of Psychology where they argue, in a nutshell, they say, because of the types of beings that human beings are, they necessarily have free will. See how he sort of flips it? On the one hand, Alex O'Connor says, trees cannot have free will because of the type of being that they are. Gantt and Williams say, that's right, human beings are not the types of beings that trees are. They're a different kind of being, and therefore they have free will. So let me unpack that. Gantt and Williams, they pick up where Heidegger left off, right? They are using phenomenology, and they're using they're trying to understand human ontology to figure out if human beings have free will, right? And so Gantt and Williams will say, yeah, human free will or human agency is fundamental to human being. What does that mean? What does it mean for that to be fundamental? Well, this is what they mean. They're going to take, well, they don't do this, but I connected the dots, right? This is a similar argument that Chalmers makes in his famous paper about consciousness and the hard problem of consciousness. Chalmers says, there's no biological mechanism or process that can explain how consciousness comes to be. Why, we can't, even though we can explain the processes and mechanisms themselves, they don't explain why experience accompanies those processes. So that's the hard problem of consciousness. And he says, I'm going to propose that consciousness is a fundamental aspect of human being. And he says, this is a perfectly valid move because physicists did this when they were trying to discover or learn about gravity. For physicists, gravity could not be broken down into subparticles, and it couldn't be broken down into other sub-processes. And yet it was a force that they observed, and they said, okay, we can't reduce gravity into subparts or processes, so gravity must be a fundamental force of physics. And so we're going to reconceptualize our model of physics to include gravity as a fundamental force within physics. And Chalmers then goes on to say, yeah, and now we're going to do the same thing with psychology. Consciousness is a fundamental, aspect of human being and of human psychology that cannot be reduced to subparts or subprocesses. It exists. It's part of the fundamental aspect of being a human being. Gantt and Williams do the same exact thing with agency. They say, okay, agency can't be broken down into subparts or subprocesses, and yet it exists, and it exists phenomenologically, and so it's a fundamental aspect of human ontology and of human being and what it means to be human, and it's part of human psychology that you're an agentic being. And so again, it's the tree idea, but it's sort of like taken to its logical end. Human beings are the type of beings such that they necessarily have agency, that they're agentic. Now, I want to read a part of Gantt's paper that I think will kind of like elucidate what he's talking about. These are kind of complex ideas. I think he has a really good part in his paper. So he says, a moment's reflection tells us, however, that for nearly all of our actions in the course of our lives, our agentive acts of choosing are not deliberative. That is, they are not the products of detached contemplation and analysis of alternative costs and benefits, etc. Most often, in fact, we deliberate not at all. We simply do what we intend to do, what needs to be done, what the situation calls for, in one way or another, and what makes sense. This phenomenological fact requires us to search for a type of agentive action alternative to any deliberative imposition of the will. We propose that there is such a class of actions, and that these actions are more fundamental than the kind of deliberative choosing that defines the character and actions within the classical libertarian conceptions of free will. It may seem paradoxical to say that the fundamental fact of human freedom is not the imposition of a choice by the will onto the world, but rather it is a sort of a yielding of oneself to a perception or conception of the world, or some aspect of our lived world. We may refer to this kind of choosing as type 2 choice. The idea here is that agency entails a sort of yielding of self and a taking up of the world in a particular manner. This often produces a sense of the sort articulated by the phenomenologist Levinas. So, I love this quote because again, it takes a more of like a phenomenological approach. Instead of trying to deduce what free agency is or what free will is, I think they make a good argument for why it does exist, why it necessarily exists, because of the types of beings that we are. But then they start to describe kind of how we experience free will, and which is something like, we kind of give in to things and we yield to things, right? And I think that actually sort of like encapsulates the other comments that Alex has made about competing motivations, right? Where instead of viewing, um, instead of like framing the debate around free will, instead of framing the debate around motivations and their competition, we kind of have like a better model where motivation is sort of like a sub part of that model. And when we experience sort of like our giving in to maybe, let's say, even temptation or some type of enticing, whether it be negative or positive, whatever, right? We exercise our agency by allowing ourselves to do or engage in XY activity, right? So that's kind of what Gantt and Williams are proposing. This particular paper, I'll put in the links. I'll put it in the link, but it's one of the most popular papers in Frontiers of Psychology. It's like in the 95th percentile for download. So I think it's a fantastic paper. I don't agree exactly with everything that Gantt and Williams say all the time, but this particular paper was amazing. So I'll link that below. So I think I've done a good job of sort of like addressing the 3 points that Alex made, right? His point about competing motivations. My response to that is Heidegger's response that we're presuming too much if we think that motivations, desires, and emotions are causal forces that are similar to physical forces. I think the logical positivist, foundations of Freudian psychology and most of psychology are they're actually not supported by the evidence. That's a big problem in psychology. Second issue was the determinism and indeterminism debate. I won't say too much more about that. But because I think that's sort of like there's not much more to say. But I do like Gantt's model because it does sort of allow the antecedents to be relevantly connected to the consequence, but it's not so connected that there's like a deterministic um uh their nature can't be deterministic, right? It's not that like that. The final point about ontology, the ontology of a tree. Human beings are not like trees. Their being is other, such that they necessarily have free will. So um, I think there's a good case to make that the debate certainly is not finished. I think there are stronger and stronger cases for why we can believe in human agency, and I think those are very much underexplored and worth talking about. Anyway, thank you for your time and attention. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Okay, so welcome to the post-credit scene. Um, I wanted to unpack a little bit more about Gantt Williams's um, paper. If you're familiar with Gantt and Williams, you will know that they are Mormons. They're BYU professors. And so the portion of the video that I read, if you're an astute student of the Book of Mormon, you will notice that they used a lot of language that's found in the Book of Mormon, specifically in Mosiah, right? Mosiah says, the natural man is an enemy of God and will be, and has been since the fall, unless he yieldeth to the enticings of the Holy Spirit. And Gantt and Williams, they literally take from the Book of Mormon to inform their psychological paper, and it's become one of the greatest, among the greatest hits in psychology. So, I think there's a lot of power in the restored gospel and what it teaches us and what it can say about free will and morality. And I think BYU professors are doing a great job of kind of bringing that out to the world in a way that they'll accept, that it's palatable for them. Anyways, thanks everyone. Everyone take care.